3 days after I lost the baby, my husband came to me in the kitchen. I was standing at the stove, heating water for nothing in particular, just needing something to do with my hands. He stood in the doorway and said 4 words. Not, "Are you all right?" Not, "I am sorry." 4 words, and they weren't about me at all. I didn't move. I kept my eyes on the pot. The water wasn't boiling yet. I remember thinking very clearly, if I don't turn around, maybe he won't say it again. He said it again. I turned around. I looked at my husband, the man I had married at 19 in my parents' house on a Tuesday in October, the man I had cooked for and prayed beside and tried to give a child to for 2 years, and I said nothing. Because I had been taught my entire life that saying nothing was faithfulness. That silence was the shape obedience took. And I turned back to the water, which was finally starting to boil, and I told myself, this is what marriage is. This is what being a wife means. This is my duty and I will endure it. I had heard those words before, inside my own head. I had used them before. But I did not know, standing at that stove 3 days after losing my baby, that I would need them again so soon. Stay with me, because what I am about to tell you about what is expected of Amish women after a miscarriage is going to make you angry. And if you grew up in a world anything like mine, it is going to make you feel something else too. Something quieter. Something that takes a long time to name. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in Wayne County, Ohio. I left several years ago, and this channel, Hannah the Amish Girl, is where I finally say the things my community would never allow me to say out loud. If you want to hear more hidden truths like this one, please subscribe and tap the like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me explain something that took me years of therapy to understand. To understand what my husband said in that doorway, and why he said it, and why I turned back to the stove without answering, you have to understand how Amish theology treats a woman's body inside of marriage. Not how it appears from the outside, how it actually works from the inside of it, when no one is watching. There are 3 things the church teaches, not from a pulpit, not with those exact words, but in the accumulation of everything that is said and not said your entire life. The first is that a wife's body belongs to her husband, not in a cruel way, not spoken as cruelty, spoken as scripture, as order, as the way God designed the world to function. The husband is the head, the wife is the body serves. The second is that difficulty is not a reason to stop. In my community, hardship was not something to be solved, it was something to be moved through. Endurance was faithfulness. Stopping, slowing, asking for accommodation, that was weakness. At worst, it was hochmut, pride, the belief that your own comfort mattered more than your duty, the greatest sin in the Amish world. The third thing, a woman's grief is private, and it is brief. You are permitted to feel it. You are not permitted to let it slow the household. The meals still need cooking, the floors still need scrubbing, the children, if you have them, still need tending. And if you do not have them yet, that absence is also a kind of work, the work of trying again. Put those 3 things together and you begin to understand what my husband meant when he stood in the doorway 3 days after I lost our baby and said those 4 words. He wasn't being monstrous, he was being faithful. That is the part that took me the longest to understand. That is the part that still makes me sit very still when I think about it. I need to tell you about the pregnancy first, because it matters. I had been trying for 2 years. 2 years of quiet hope and quieter disappointment, month after month, while my sister had her 2nd child, and my neighbor had her 3rd, and no one said anything to me directly, but I felt the weight of their not saying everywhere. In Amish communities, children are not just a blessing. They are evidence. Evidence that your marriage is right, that God is pleased, that the household is ordered properly. A woman without children is not quite complete. That is never said. It is only felt, constantly, in every conversation that moves carefully around you. When I finally became pregnant, I did not tell anyone for the first 8 weeks. I was afraid to. I had learned by then that hope was something to protect, to keep small and close, because the world had many ways of taking things. At 8 weeks, I told my husband Daniel, and he nodded and said, "Good," and went back to the harness he was mending. That was his way. Not cold, not unfeeling, just shaped by a world that did not give men language for tenderness. I told my mother the following Sunday. She held my hand for a moment longer than usual. That was how joy was expressed, in the length of a handhold. I was 11 weeks along when I started bleeding. I will not describe those hours in detail. I will only tell you that by the end of them, I understood something I had never understood before, which is that the body can hold tremendous grief without making a sound. I did not cry out. I did not wake Daniel. I sat in the dark in the bathroom and I managed alone, the way I had been taught to manage everything. By morning it was over. I told Daniel at breakfast. He set down his fork. He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked his fork back up and said we would try again. That was the whole conversation. I washed the dishes. In the weeks that followed, I moved through the house like something hollowed. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone would have named as grief. I cooked and cleaned and attended church and smiled at the right moments and said the right words, and inside I was somewhere very far away, in a room with no windows, sitting on the floor. My mother visited once. She brought a pie. She patted my arm and said, "The Lord's timing was not our timing." I said yes. My neighbor Ruth came by and said she had lost one too, before her first, and that it gets easier. I said thank you. These were the offerings my community knew how to make. They were not nothing, but they were also not enough. They were comfort-shaped around an absence that no one fully acknowledged. There is no Amish ceremony for a miscarriage, no gathering, no spoken grief, no formal marking of the loss. The pregnancy had happened inside my body, privately, and the ending of it was also private. You fold it away, you continue. And then, on the 3rd day, Daniel came to the kitchen doorway and said those 4 words. What he said was, "When are you ready?" He meant, when would I be ready to try again? That was what he was asking. Not cruelly, not impatiently, or at least, not in the way impatience looks from the outside. He asked it the way a farmer asks about a field that has gone fallow, with the practical concern of someone whose livelihood depends on the season. I did not answer him that morning. I turned back to the water, which was boiling now, and I poured it into nothing and set the pot back on the stove. He waited a moment, then went out to the barn. That evening I told him I was not ready. He said he understood. He was a good man. I want you to hold that alongside everything else I am telling you. He was a good man inside a system that had given him no tools for this moment, just as it had given me no tools, just as it had given my mother no tools, and her mother before her. The tools that existed were for production, for continuation, for the faithful maintenance of what the community required. The tools for sitting with a woman in her grief, for asking what she needed, for receiving the answer even if it was inconvenient, those tools had never been made. They had never been considered necessary. I thought about that a great deal in the weeks that followed. I thought about what it meant that the community had a protocol for nearly everything, for how to grieve a dead elder, for how long to sit with a bereaved family, for what food to bring and when. The Ordnung governed the shape of sorrow in nearly every situation it had ever thought to name. It had simply never thought to name this one. A miscarriage was a woman's matter, and women's matters were managed inside the house, inside the body, inside the silence. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here, not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. My friend Rebecca lost 2 pregnancies before her third took. She told me once, years later after she had also left, that after her first loss, her husband had waited 11 days before asking. She had thought at the time that 11 days was generous. She used that word, generous. After her second loss, he waited 4 days. She said she understood why. They had already waited so long for a child. The farm needed an heir. The community watched. The pressure on him was also real, even if it landed on her body. She said she never blamed him. But she also said this. She wished, just once, someone had sat with her in the dark. Not to solve anything, not to plan anything. Just to sit there and not require her to be ready for what came next. She had waited her whole life for someone to do that, she said. She was 42 years old when she told me this. She was still waiting. I did not know what to say. So I sat with her in the car where we were talking, and I said nothing, and I did not move for a long time. It was the most useful thing I had ever done for another person. I have thought about Rebecca often since then, about the arithmetic of her grief. 11 days the first time, 4 days the second. The number going down. As if the first loss had used up whatever allowance of waiting the marriage could afford. As if her body's grief had a budget, and the budget had already been partially spent. I think about all the Rebeccas I never knew. The women in farmhouses across Ohio and Indiana and Pennsylvania, who managed alone in the dark, and then folded it away, and then were asked, a handful of days later, whether they were ready. Who said yes, or said nothing, which in that world amounted to the same thing. Who stood at their stoves the next morning with their hands busy, and their grief still unfinished, unnamed, given no room and no time. 6 weeks after the miscarriage, Daniel came to me again, not at the kitchen doorway this time, at the bedroom door. Later. The lamp was already out. I heard him come in from his evening reading, heard the familiar sounds of him moving in the dark, the small sounds I had memorized over 3 years of marriage, and I knew before he reached the bed what he was going to ask. Not with words. He didn't use words. He reached across and put his hand on my arm, gently, and waited. I lay still for a long moment. I thought about the kitchen doorway and the pot of boiling water and the 3 days. I thought about what my mother had told me the night before my wedding, which was only this. A wife gives her husband what he needs. I thought about Rebecca waiting to be sat with, and then I thought about the inside of my own body, which still hurt in ways I had no language for, which had held something and then released it and had not yet finished grieving the release. And I made the only decision I knew how to make, which was the decision I had been trained my entire life to make. I did not say no. I am not proud of that. I am not ashamed of it either, not anymore. I was a woman inside a system that had taught me to override myself as an act of faithfulness. What I did that night was not consent in the way I understand consent now. It was compliance. And I had been taught since childhood that these were the same thing. They are not the same thing. That sentence took me 4 years of therapy to be able to say out loud. I want to tell you about the morning after because this is the part that stayed with me the longest. I woke before Daniel, the way I always did. I dressed, went to the kitchen, started the stove, began the bread. Everything exactly as it had always been. And standing there in that early light with my hands in the dough, I felt something I did not have a name for then. I have a name for it now. It was grief for a version of myself that had been able to ask for more time, and did not. Not because she was weak, because she had never been given the idea that asking was permitted. The Ordnung, the rules that governed every part of our lives, said nothing about this, nothing about what a husband owed a wife who had just lost a pregnancy, nothing about how long a woman's body needed before she was asked again. The silence of the Ordnung on that subject was not an accident. What the Ordnung does not address, the wife absorbs. That was the rule underneath the rule. I stood at that kitchen window for a long time that morning, watching the light come up over the barn roof, the fields still pale and cold, the horses moving slowly in the paddock. Everything looked exactly the same as it had always looked. And I thought, nothing in this view knows what happened last night. The barn does not know. The horses do not know. The fields do not know. Only my body knows. And my body had no one to tell. I left 3 years after that morning. The leaving was its own long story, its own accumulation of silences. Daniel did not come with me. We were not the same after I left, because you cannot leave the Amish and remain married to someone inside it. The shunning settled over the telephone like a curtain. His voice on the one call I managed was careful, clipped, performing the distance the church required. I understood. I had been taught the same performance. I did not hold it against him in the way that would have been easy to hold it. I held it the way you hold something heavy. Not with anger, but with the full knowledge of its weight. There is a woman I know now, English, who lost a pregnancy and took 3 months before she felt ready to try again. Her husband waited. He asked her every few weeks how she was feeling, not whether she was ready, but how she was feeling, and he listened to the answer. She told me this over coffee, and I sat there trying to understand it the way you try to understand a language you were never taught. 3 months. He asked how she was feeling. He listened. I turned those facts over in my mind for days afterward. Not with bitterness, not anymore. With something closer to wonder. That a marriage could hold that much space. That a man could be taught to offer it. That this was possible, and that I had not known it was possible. And that not knowing had cost me something I still do not have a clean name for. My therapist asked me once what I would have needed in those 6 weeks, if I could have had anything. I sat with the question for a long time. What I finally said was, I would have needed someone to ask me what I needed. Not to assume. Not to wait a certain number of days and then return as if the counting was the accommodation. To actually ask, what does your body need right now? And how long does it need it? And what can I do that would help? That question would have changed everything, not just in those 6 weeks. In the entire shape of my marriage, in the entire way I understood my own body and my own permission inside my own life. One question, asked once, with real willingness to hear the answer. I never received it. I gave it to myself eventually in a therapist's office in a city I had driven to alone, on a Tuesday, 4 years after I left. The same day of the week as my wedding. I noticed that. I don't know what it means. I think it means something. The Amish world gave me things I carry always. Community so deep it has a texture you don't find anywhere else. A knowledge of my own hands that has served me through every hard year since. Faith. Damaged, reconstructed, unrecognizable in some lights, but still present. But there is no theology that requires a woman's body to be available before it has finished grieving. There is no scripture that I have found, and I have looked, that names a wife's readiness as less important than a husband's waiting. The system that produced Daniel's question in that doorway, 3 days after our loss, was not malicious. It was simply a system that had never been required to consider the question from the inside of the body that carries the loss. A miscarriage does not happen to a marriage. It happens inside a woman. And then she is asked, 3 days later, when she is ready to try again. That distance between where the loss lives and where the question comes from, that is the whole story. Not the man in the doorway, the distance. If you grew up in a world where your body's needs were secondary to your household's requirements, I see you. If you ever endured something before you were ready, because you had no language for not being ready, I see you. If you sat with a grief that had no ceremony and no name and no allotted time, and then got up and made breakfast anyway, I see you. Your body was always yours. Even when they taught you otherwise, even when you believed them, even on the mornings when you stood at the stove with your hands in dough and didn't yet have the words. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the Ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.